listener, and welcome to the iCast. I'm your host, Jonah Walker, and I'm really excited to have you here with us today. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, the iCast is an interdisciplinary science podcast where we chat and ask questions with researchers from all sorts of different scientific fields. But don't worry, you do not need to be a scientist to follow along. In addition to hosting the iCast, I also serve as the senior editor of the iScientist, our interdisciplinary undergraduate research journal here at McMaster University. You can check out the journal using the link in the description. Today, for our inaugural episode, we're diving into something truly fascinating, women's health and medicine in ancient Egypt. And joining me to discuss this is Dinithi Fernando, a student researcher who has explored the evolution of can you say it properly?
Obstetrics and Gynecology.
Obstetrics and Gynecology in ancient Egypt. We'll talk about how ancient Egyptian civilization approached women's health, the intersection of medicine and spirituality, and the roles that women played both as patients and as practitioners. Dinithi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
All right, so this is going to be, obviously this is the inaugural episode, so the first thing I just want to emphasize to you and to our listener is that this is an unstructured conversation. We have a few guiding questions, but most of my knowledge of your work comes from the fact that we were in the same research group last year with Dr. Sarah Simmons. That was such a fun time, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
No, it was great. It was great. Now, we were doing different projects, but every week I was lucky enough to hear about all sorts of the different, papyruses and papyri. Yeah. See, I in my mind, I was like, which one is it?
I got you.
But you got me. And so I think my first question for you is going to be about your sources. Do you were you pouring through hieroglyphics here, or what sort of sources did you use to do your project?
Yeah, so basically when I was looking at the sources in terms of papyri and stuff, obviously I don't read hieratic and I have very rudimentary familiarity with it in general. Mm-hmm. So in terms of actually translating the papyri, I was looking at various different translations and cross-comparing them because, obviously it's not fair to just look at one interpretation and translation of it. So I was looking at a couple different options and I ended up cross-comparing 3 of the Kahan papyrus.
Okay.
And then 2 different translations of certain sections of the Ebers papyrus.
Okay. And for someone who may not know,
talk
to me about the difference between these papyrus. I will definitely butcher the name of what you just said, but I want to know, are they separated by when they were found or where they were found, or what sort of papyri were these? Yeah,
so they're separated, like you said, between from when they were written, when they were found, and that kind of thing. But it's also separated based on the actual content of the papyri themselves. So when we're talking about the medical papyri in reference to ancient Egypt, there are 5 main ones, and I looked at a couple of them just because translations weren't really available of some others. So the Kahan papyrus was my main one, and that's the oldest papyrus of all of them.
Cool. How old?
It was the copy that we have that we translate is dated approximately to 1820 BCE.
Damn.
So this is pretty old.
That's pretty old.
But it's basically the content of that one is entirely or mostly gynecological, and it's pertaining particularly to women's issues and women's health. So there's gynecological facts or treatments, and then also obstetric treatments. And then I was also looking at certain sections of the Ebers papyrus because that is also it's the more general medical one. Mm-hmm. So the Ebers and the Berlin one are the more general medical ones. They were found, or the copies that we use are approximately from 1500 BCE and 1200 BCE respectively. Those are more general, but they both have some sections that pertain to gynecological knowledge. Mm-hmm. So I used those ones as well. I also used some translations of the Ramesseum IV papyrus.
Okay.
And that one also, that section also has a lot of gynecological and pediatric knowledge. And then the Carlsberg 8 papyrus, I only had a couple translations, so I didn't use it a ton. But that one is also known to have a lot of information about the gynecological understanding.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I think. But what did you call the language? I keep calling them papyri, but what is the actual hieroglyphic language?
It's written in typically when we're looking at the medical papyri, it's written in hieratic script, which is
script.
kind of kind of like shorthand would be for English.
Okay.
Hieratic is to hieroglyphics.
Okay.
So it's that kind of thing. It's basically what most people would know as like hieroglyphics.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That is awesome.
Yeah.
So obviously, I'm sitting here listening to you talk about all these sorts of translations and multiple translations and cross-referencing them. It sounds like a very difficult task to all put together. Honestly, you inspired me every week when you came in and you were like, oh, yeah, I just like read these papyruses today. Papyri. Oh, my goodness.
It's all good.
So I guess my first question to you is, like, what inspired you to focus on the history of obstetrics and gynecology, even knowing that it was going to be this difficult to study in ancient Egypt?
Sure. I think, so my research interests in general look at historical medicine just because I'm a very strong believer that, like, you know, you have to delineate the progress that we've made in order to understand where we can go, right? So that's my main focus on, like, why I studied historical medicine. And then with gynecology and obstetrics specifically, I was looking really at, like, women's health, historically speaking and generally speaking, is pretty understudied.
Okay.
And I think that having an understanding of women's health even today would help us to like further our development and progress. Additionally, ancient Egypt is pretty unique in terms of historical civilizations because a lot of times we see that women were marginalized throughout history, whereas in ancient Egypt there is a certain aspect of I'd say like power that's granted to women in terms of like their autonomy and just like the structure of how the society was set up. So I think looking at their healthcare specifically, even though it was such an ancient civilization, it's really interesting to see that, like, you know, what would it look like even if we don't have like the current biomedical understanding that we have today, but we still did have a society that did value women as contributing members.
Right. That's a super cool point there that you just talked about, how this is in ancient Egypt, this was a civilization where women were more empowered and their healthcare was taken more seriously. Why? Like, what do you think the contributing factors are to that? Was it due to their religion, maybe, or was it just kind of it always had been that way?
So I'm going to preface this by saying a lot of this is my understanding and interpretation from what I've studied, and also like a lot of my opinion influences this as well. But I do think that having the presence of female deities and also female rulers and women in power, which wasn't even all that common in ancient Egypt as well, like I should note that. But I think with Egyptian spirituality, a lot of times the gods and their experiences and their stories reflected, in a way, the experiences of the everyday person. Right?
Okay.
So I think seeing these female deities that weren't respected any less than male deities really just kind of cemented that idea that, like, even in society, that equality in terms of like value was given to both genders. I should note, however, that like my specific area of study for this project that I did didn't really look at like the different social strata of women. So obviously this isn't accounting for women that were in indentured servitude and that kind of stuff, just because like a lot of the textual stuff that I was using reflected mostly the experiences of like the upper class women.
Okay.
So it is a little bit biased in that sense, but I think that's
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But that is a very interesting idea that you would have. And that makes total logical sense that if you have female deities, then you have then you can build a society that is more respectful and considerate for women. But I want to ask another question about with a spiritual angle, which is that your specific project, obstetrics and gynecology.
You can call it OBGYN.
I think I'm gonna.
A lot of people would be familiar with that
I'm gonna
too.
call it OBGYN because I keep messing it up.
No, it's totally fine.
I think
it's hard.
Okay.
It's tough.
My question is, how did the ancient Egyptians view childbirth within the context of their spirituality?
Yeah. So obviously, I can't speak on behalf of the ancient Egyptians and their views as a whole.
Yeah.
But from what we've gathered as like Egyptologists and through research, we can pretty much kind of tell that like fertility was a really big big deal, for lack of a better word. Like, it was of utmost importance.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. And obviously, like, that's the truth in almost any society. Like, a factor by which you're measured is how well you're able to produce offspring, right, and carry on the society.
Sure.
And in terms of childbirth itself, there were a lot of, like, spiritual aspects. So, like, some people argue for the presence of birthing huts that were there. Some people would argue that because there are structures that show, like, deities, like Hathor and Bes, for example, like, who were known for their roles in childbirth. Right. There are structures that do bear their likeness, right? And a lot of people have assumed that these are like temples that women would go to give birth. Some other peoples argue for the fact that this is just where women would go before they gave birth to, like, make offerings and, like, kind of just make peace with the gods to, like, but, like, ask for the intervention for a safe birth and protection. Right. So that's kind of a way in which the spiritual beliefs influenced it. Does that make sense?
That all makes a lot of sense. Wait, remind me of the two gods that you mentioned that had to deal with fertility and childbirth.
Yeah, so there are a couple. Okay. I'm going to mention Bes. So that's a male deity, actually, and he was made. His purpose was to, in childbirth, like, ward off any negative spirits. There was also Hathor, who is a pretty big goddess in general, and her role is also for protection, but also to, like, represent the mother and the divine feminine. There was also, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but it's Tauret. Her likeness is often to, like, a hippo.
Cool.
And that's also, like, illustrating, like, fertility, because usually she's depicted as pregnant, and her amulets are seen as, like, protection amulets for pregnant women and newborns. Cool. So, yeah, those are the...
Okay. And so these gods, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of them have to do... So, like, when we say the word fertility, right, we're talking about, I guess, having an easy childbirth and an easy pregnancy. Or are we talking more about easy to get pregnant?
Yeah, fertility is more so, like, the easy to get pregnant kind of aspect of things, where it's more so, like, just essentially, like, the ability to get pregnant.
Okay. So then when we think about, or actually, I'm actually going to phrase it this way. I'm going to say, what sort of medical interventions did the ancient Egyptians have during the actual process of childbirth, and then were those also connected to these deities? That might be a loaded question, so maybe we can break it down a little. So,
in terms of medical interventions, there isn't a ton of evidence to suggest that there were any. Like, there are a couple areas that indicate, like, of the papyri themselves, that indicate, like, how to induce labor, how to, like, make labor progress easier, and those are mainly in the Kahan papyrus. But then when you're talking about, like, the actual process of childbirth, there were birthing stools for a lot of women, and that's kind of widely recognized, which is really cool, because if you think about it, even today, like, the squatting position is more beneficial for the mother and child in terms of, like, comfort and safety.
I've heard that.
So that's one aspect. And then also there was a knife that was used, and it's like a fishtail-shaped knife that's also used in funerary rituals.
Okay.
But it's believed that was used to sever the umbilical cord.
Okay.
So those are, like, the main ones that I can think of off the top of my head in terms of medical interventions for childbirth. But, yeah.
So when did the papyri talk at all about maybe, like, a complication in the pregnancy, or maybe it would be even more spiritual, like some sort of, like, bad omen, or really anything that might cause a pregnant mother to go hit one of these birthing temples and start praying for an easier job?
I'm not entirely sure about that one. I know there are some, like, verses of the papyri, or areas of the papyri that do indicate what to do for like pain after childbirth.
Okay.
So like there are remedies for that. And there are some like that I looked at which were about like fertility testing.
Okay.
But I'm not entirely sure if there was some for like during the childbirth to identify if it was going to be difficult.
Right.
There definitely could have been, you know,
Right.
especially like in the spiritual sense of looking at things, just because spirituality was directly interwoven with ancient Egyptian medicine. Like they're not two separate concepts like we understand them today. So there absolutely could have been an understanding there. I'm just not that well versed in that side of things.
Or it just doesn't. The information has been lost. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's also
exactly
a definite problem.
I know. Even in the papyri that I was looking at, like if you look at the actual state of it, it's if you Google the Kahan papyrus and you look at a picture of it, it's very fragmented.
Okay.
So even the translations that we do have will have like, if you're looking at English translations, it'll have like ... in the middle where there was just a hole in the
There's
papyrus.
just a hole in the
like
papyrus.
There's just a hole. There's nothing there.
I guess that makes sense.
And so that is something to consider just in general
Right.
when looking at these kinds of ancient sources, is that you're not always going to have all the information
Exactly.
that's been preserved. So
yeah. That must be such a difficult line to walk academically. And I've just noticed you here saying like, or my understanding according to the historical record, it's a very unique kind of how should I put this? It's like a unique disclaimer in science where it's like, you know, that this information has been lost. You know, we don't even really know
exactly
what's going
and
on.
even when it comes to like translating hieratic in itself, like if you're looking at like plant remedies, for example, we don't know for sure for a lot of the plants that were used. Like we can identify the way that hieratic's written is there are certain identifiers, kind of like if you're familiar with like accents in certain languages, like on top of letters.
Yeah, I dabble in French.
Yeah. So there are like certain identifiers in the script itself that would identify like, oh, this is a plant. So like when you're reading it, you can say, okay, I know this is a plant, but we don't know what plant it is.
Okay.
So that's one thing that I had to be really cautious of, especially with this, because it's like even when we can translate it and we do know what it's saying, we don't know for sure that that is the same plant that we use today. We don't know that it's called the same thing.
Right.
You know, so there's a lot of, unless people have reached a general consensus.
Yeah. So something that kind of relates to something that I ran into in my project, where a key indicator within the ancient Egyptian star clocks was the star Sirius.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I remember you talking about this.
But we weren't sure whether that Sirius was the same Sirius that we know today, that has like the same right ascension and declination, which is for the non-astro listener, that's like a longitude and latitude of a star in the night sky. Is that's kind of similar with like your plant stuff?
Yeah, it's very similar. I think that's one aspect, and then again, like the actual text itself is another aspect for mine. So it's you know. So
it says it's like, okay, are we talking when you're reading these translations, is it like a translation of like, is it almost like a recipe or like a to-do list, or is it just kind of like a one-off reference to like, oh, this sort of stuff happens in OBGYN, or is it like here's the steps, here's how you take, you know, some plant and rub it here or like grind it up?
So it depends on the papyrus. It also depends on the section of the papyrus. Because I use the Kahan one specifically, I'm going to mainly use that one. What you typically have is you're going to, in each case, so there's, I believe, 34 cases in the Kahan papyrus that are listed. And each of these cases usually follows the structure of like, this is the symptom, or this is like the ailment that someone's presenting with. And then this is like... Basically, the structure that it'll follow mainly is, so it'll be like instructions for a woman suffering from, and then it'll describe the ailment. And it'll be like, you should declare about her. So that's an actual diagnosis. And then you should prescribe for it, and then the actual, like what you do, right? The actual prescription or the methodology that you should follow. So, for example, for one of them, it would be like, I'm just trying to find one that's like all my translations were in agreement with each other.
It could be in disagreement too. That's cool science as well, listener.
Absolutely. So, okay, for example, for someone that has like leg pain caused by walking, it would be diagnosed as like discharge of the womb.
Okay.
And that also has to do with the general understanding of obstetrics and gynecology in Egyptology, is that the womb was central to like the health of the woman as well. Right. So if you had pain in like your legs caused by walking, this would be discharged as like diagnosed as discharge from the womb, and then the treatment for that would be like smearing the feet and calves with mud.
Okay.
And I'm assuming that's a specific type of mud that you're getting it from the side of the Nile. But I'm not entirely sure about that. And then that's done until you're recovered. So that's kind of like the idea.
Okay. So I have two questions in my mind about that one. I'm going to start with one of them, and then we're going to go to the other one. My first question is, the womb is central to the health of a woman. Did you?
Yeah.
Kind of?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, for sure. So basically they had a pretty good understanding of the actual anatomy itself.
Okay.
In terms of like, maybe not necessarily like the positionality of where it was, because there are some people that suggest that the Egyptians believed in a traveling womb that would cause ailments. But they did have words for the womb, or like the uterus, as well as like the genitalia and the fetus itself. So they had an understanding of how all these aspects interplayed with each other.
Okay.
They also kind of describe childbirth and menstruation and miscarriage all with the words like the opening and the closing of the uterus.
Okay.
So that's also like a pretty big aspect of women's health, because when you see that in a papyrus, you can identify what they're talking about.
Okay.
You can usually identify what they're talking about. It's kind of unclear sometimes, but it depends. It depends. Yeah.
It depends.
I don't know if it's... I might have messed up a little there. Like, I don't know if it's necessarily fair to say that it was central to the health of the woman as a whole, but a lot of the areas that discuss women's health in general cite some aspect of the womb as a cause, even if it seems from a contemporary biomedical perspective unrelated.
Okay.
So that kind of indicates that their understanding tied those in together.
Totally. Okay. Now for my second question, which is that, so we're dealing with a literal instruction manual of what to do in what order, using what sort of substances. How was this information discovered and or passed down through Egyptian society?
Really good question.
Thank you.
So, really good question, but it is kind of nuanced in the answer.
I love nuanced answers.
It kind of requires everyone to understand the general outline of like how physicians operated in Egypt. And basically there was a hierarchy, right? So there was a hierarchy of doctors, like there were some that were in charge of others, and then that's kind of where you get that idea of like teaching, kind of like it is today, right? Like you have like attendings, residents, interns, and those are the ones like that teach the other ones, right? So there were, to the best of our knowledge right now, some sort of like schools and that kind of thing that would disseminate that knowledge, but then there was also the actual practice itself where the knowledge was disseminated, and you would be then reporting to whoever is higher up.
Okay.
Additionally, like there's a very strict code of ethics that's outlined for doctors.
Very cool.
In terms of like how the actual papyri were discovered, those were discovered obviously like later on for our contemporary understanding. I say discovered, obviously, in quotes, but they were discovered later on, and then the names that we have now are usually like where either who discovered it or where it was discovered. And yeah, I think that's the general outline. I hope that answers your question.
No, that does. That absolutely does. Okay, now my question is related to what are the gender of these doctors?
Yeah. So there's a word not a word, but in the transliterated form of hieroglyphics, so for anyone who doesn't know what transliteration is, it's when you're taking it and writing it in Roman script, to the best of our understanding. Mm-hmm. The actual word for doctor would be represented by SW and W. Okay. Adding a T at the end of this word would make it feminine. Right? And we do see in various areas of papyri, as well as on tombs and in funeral writings, that people are identified as SW and WT, which would be the feminine, right?
There we go.
So that is where we do believe, that's, I would say, one of the strongest pieces of evidence suggesting that there were female doctors. They're not necessarily explicitly discussed everywhere. And I just think that might be because we don't have enough textual resources to understand the society as a whole. We're basically working to piece together this idea of what Egypt was like, because obviously none of us actually lived in it.
Of course.
So women in medicine, it's still highly debated. And there are certain main figures that are known. So for example, Akhenaten is the woman. There's stela from Akhenaten's tomb that's dedicated to Pesichet. I am hoping that I'm saying that right. And that would be a woman that's referred to as the overseer of the funerary priests, as well as overseer of lady physicians, based on our current translation. So it fully depends on who translated the source and how they're interpreting that, but that is just some of the evidence to suggest that there were female doctors.
Right. That's interesting that we can have that last position you talked about there, an overseer of funeral practices and
overseer of female physicians.
Overseer of female physicians, right? And this just goes back to the idea that spirituality and healthcare were intertwined throughout ancient Egypt. So, do you know of any instances where there's a distinction between medical and magical practices, or are they always intertwined?
Okay. Before I get to that, I want to make a quick note on the previous point.
Please do.
Just because I forgot to mention that a lot of people with that little T thing that I mentioned earlier about ascribing that to the feminine, a lot of people also suggest that might have been a scribal error.
Okay.
So for everyone listening, that's not necessarily fact. Again, things are a little bit in the gray area here, but a lot of people might just be these were ascribed very quickly by people that were copying records. So that might also have been an error. But to answer your other question, repeat it one more time for me.
So we have kind of gathered based on your previous answer that there is there's a medical and magical practices are pretty much intertwined almost constantly. But I was just curious if there was any instance where they were separated.
Yeah. So that is kind of one of the limitations, actually, of looking at Egyptian society from a modern lens. Okay? Because, for us, it might seem, kind of outlandish that they're so intertwined, right?
Okay.
But inherently, when you're looking at Egyptian society as a whole and the civilization, spirituality was ingrained in every aspect of life. And medicine is no example, just because that was the truth, right, to them. So if that is their truth, that is then interwoven into medicine. They're not separable at all. But I do want to point out that, just because it is magico-medical, as a lot of people do refer to it, it doesn't delegitimize the actual medical innovation or the knowledge, just because, they did have a very structured system of medicine. And just because this was intertwined with their beliefs, you could say that about any society, right? Ethics are beliefs,
That's true. Yeah.
All of those ethical codes that we have are also governed by our belief of what's right and wrong. So there are religious undertones that are inseparable.
Right.
But the actual, even their actual conceptualization of health and illness ties into that as well.
Right.
I won't get into that because it's a bit of a long thing, but essentially, no, they are not separable.
No, they're not separable.
And even in the papyri themselves, there are what we would call physical remedies. So, for example, grinding up plants and using them. But even in those remedies, there are incantations that you would say over those, or you would leave them out for a certain amount of time because of a spiritual belief.
Right.
So they're not separable.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And so I think that's almost like the point of the podcast in your previous answer right there, which is like, just because these two things are intertwined doesn't necessarily mean you can't discount them.
Yeah.
Because it worked, right? These are practices that were passed down for through generations, right?
Like,
and taught from, older, or I guess elder practitioners to younger ones. How could ancient Egyptians keep track of what worked and what didn't work?
Yeah. The same way that we do today.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you think about it, like in the example that you mentioned about papers, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like someone with absolutely no authority who hasn't done the research could publish a paper, right? So in the same way, the Egyptians, they obviously had a more empirical understanding, so they were applying, what worked to solve these daily challenges. Mm-hmm. And that's a very, I feel like, very human-centric approach to medicine, which I think is a great thing. They also focused a lot on passing down the knowledge that was already had. So even though, like, my period of study was from Old Kingdom Egypt to New Kingdom Egypt, which is like approximately like 2,600 years. That's a long time, right? And if we're looking at that, like, the copies of some papyri that we have from the beginning of this, like in Old Kingdom Egypt, didn't change a lot in New Kingdom Egypt, and that's a long period of time to not have change. It has to do kind of with the idea that Egyptians had concerning the notion of progress. Right. I won't get too much into that, but it's essentially the idea that, like, they had tracked what worked. Like, they tracked what was going on. They tracked what worked for that. They tracked what they used around them to solve those issues, right? And if it's working consistently, then I think the idea that we see in a lot of historical medicine is that it has to work.
Right.
There wasn't necessarily this need to know why it works that we have in contemporary biomedicine or, like, contemporary research even, where it's just like, we're focusing on the whole patient. We're focusing on how this substance or this incantation or this treatment methodology in general affects the whole patient. We're not necessarily looking at how does the specific compound impact the specific cell.
Right.
So, and that's not to say that the Egyptians wouldn't have done that if they had the same, resources and time that we have now, but it is to say that it was still science. I don't think it's to discount that, and I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make when looking at the history of science as a whole. Yeah.
What I want to learn a little bit more about is your opinion on what modern gynecology and OBGYN could learn from these ancient Egyptian techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my first main one would be the actual position of birthing.
Okay.
Obviously, the most common position of birthing is with a woman in the hospital on her back, kind of thing. At least in first world countries where we have access to those resources, and in contemporary biomedicine as a whole. Whereas the Egyptians used the squatting, as I mentioned earlier, right? Or at least we are pretty sure that they did. Right. And I think that is something that even modern research backs up in a sense, where it's like this does make more sense for a more efficient progression of labor, and it's much more comfortable for the mother and the child. So that's one thing that I think modern medicine could definitely take into account, because I feel like a lot of times there is an emphasis on the ease for the actual medical practitioner rather than the ease of the patient, just because we're not necessarily looking at the patient as a whole all the time. I would say also, let me see. Personally speaking, I think, like, the social culture in which fertility was important, but women also had autonomy over their bodies is a pretty hot topic. And I think that is also something that modern obstetrics and gynecology as a whole could maybe adapt their viewpoint to. That's what I'm going to say on that one.
Totally. And so just remind me really quick, the range that your papyri spanned, like
time-wise?
Time-wise.
Yeah. I'm just going to give you the actual numbers. So I'm looking from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, which is like approximately from like 2686 to 1070 BCE.
Okay.
So that's my time period.
Did you happen to write anything about the sort of politics or like kind of what was going on in ancient Egypt during those years?
I didn't really focus on that just for like brevity's sake.
Of course. It's already 80 pages long. Like,
it is a pretty hefty assignment, I'd say. But at the same time, I did mention like you do see in the papyri themselves, like if we're talking about those, we'll see towards the New Kingdom and in the New Kingdom copies of like even the ancient papyri that have just been copied and scribed over and over again, you see influences from Nubian community. So we'll see like the incorporation of Nubian deities into the into the actual medical record, which is really interesting.
Cool.
We'll also see the appearance of Semitic practices that were used. So there are like Semitic languages in some of the newer texts themselves.
Right.
So that's
cool. That's
pretty cool.
I think one of the things that I remember from our lab meetings every week was how frustrated you were that some of the things that we think about in ancient times are falsely attributed to Roman society when it actually came from Egyptian society. And I was wondering, is there any like key examples that you can think of off the dome that you really need the listener to know this was actually from ancient Egypt, this was not ancient Roman, and the West is lying to you. The West doesn't want you to know the truth.
Let me see if I can think of any. I can't think of any specific examples just off the top of my head.
Right.
Just because I don't have to like search through all my notes.
It's a tough question.
Yeah. But I can say that, especially with my thesis now, which is also looking at Greek and Roman societies in conjunction with ancient Egyptian society, there's a lot of interplay, right? Because like especially during the Hellenistic and Roman period, like in the chronology of ancient Egypt that follows the New Kingdom, we're seeing like there's the Greco-Roman period, right? After the third intermediate and then the late period, there's the Greco-Roman period. And this is where we're seeing a lot of that overlap. Right. And I think because historically speaking, we've had a much better understanding of Greek language than we have of hieratic and hieroglyphic script, a lot of these discoveries that were shared from the ancient Egyptians to the Greeks, which we can then see in like Greek philosophers' writings even and their descriptions of ancient Egypt and the society, we can see that like now that we have the knowledge of the Egyptian texts, we can kind of compare and be like, this is kind of similar, but this was discovered first in Egypt because the text itself is older.
Right.
You know, and the society was thriving during that time. I think also just looking at the difference in cultural views. So I mentioned before that ancient Egypt had a pretty empowered approach to like how women were perceived in society, right? Some of the writings from Greek philosophers that visited Egypt have said that like, you know, it's ridiculous essentially that Egyptian women would be allowed out or allowed to be in power and that kind of stuff. And I think the difference in cultural values, like I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong or like that kind of thing necessarily, just because I don't think it's fair to do that when you're looking at historical societies as a whole. You just kind of take it as it is, and that mitigates your own personal bias.
Okay.
But I think looking at the difference in cultural values between the two might have influenced how much credit was given to the Egyptians and how
True.
credible they were perceived to be.
True.
In terms of the actual Greek writings that we're seeing. So.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I really like that answer. Yeah. So we are approaching our time limit, and so I actually only have one more question for you, but this is probably going to be the most loaded one.
Oh, gosh, okay.
Because of our current political climate.
All right.
So the papaya referenced various contraception and abortion methods. I want to know, were these practices widely accepted in Egyptian society, and how did they relate to the value placed on fertility?
So you're right. That was an absolutely loaded question.
Sorry.
It's totally fine. I think the actual wording, like I said, when it comes to describing the uterus and anything to do with the flow of things through the uterus, is the opening and the closing of the uterus, right?
Right.
And so when we're looking at the idea of contraception and abortion, there are methods that are listed, and our best translation of it is to say that to prevent pregnancy, right? Or for the opening of the uterus. Because of that, it's indicative that these existed. It's not my place, nor is it, I believe, anyone's place, unless they've extensively studied the society itself and all of the different sociopolitical, socioeconomic influences that would have influenced the actual beliefs at the time. I don't think it's my place to say what they believed.
Okay.
And I don't think, additionally, that it's my place to say whether or not these were widely accepted, right? Because we can't make that decision. Like, we can't make that conclusion. I can say that they definitely existed. And I can also say that a lot of the actual plants, if they've been translated correctly, which I do believe in this case that they would have been, just because there's a general consensus. Okay. A lot of these plants have been used in European societies later on as abortifacients and contraceptives. So those it's a little bit of a gray area, but I think we can say that it does exist.
Okay.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
We can say it exists.
Yeah, and I think it's not just because we do know that, like, women had a high degree of autonomy when considering their social status and also just, like, history in general relative to other historical societies. I think women had a lot of autonomy in ancient Egypt. But the society also highly valued fertility, right?
Right.
So the presence of these things and the reference to them in the papyri themselves, if translated correctly, which since multiple translations agree, I can say that I think it was. Because of that, like, I think they definitely did exist.
Right.
You know, and they were probably permissible because, again, like I mentioned earlier, there was a strict code of ethics when it came to medical practice and doctors and all, like, the medical system as a whole. So if these were then written in the actual, like, medical material that was used, it is indicative that they were permissible, but I can't necessarily say on a social level if it was widely accepted or practiced.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay, well, that is actually all the time we have today. Dinithi, thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you for having me
today. I can sincerely say that I have never heard a scientist talk with more I guess, like, poise and discretion about the topic. For such a nuanced topic, I really appreciate you coming on. I think you did a really good job.
Thank you. And you did a great job as a host, and I hope everyone that's listening will tune in for the next episode. Okay.
Well, that concludes it for today. Listener, thank you for tuning in. As always, my name is Jonah Walker, and I'll see you next week.